Welcome back. The 77th session of the UN General Assembly kicked off this past Tuesday at the UN headquarters in New York for a two-week run. Now, next week, that is on September 20th, day one of the high-level general debate, President Yoon Suk-yeol is poised to deliver a keynote speech. For more, I have Professor Chung Ku-youn at Kangwon National University joining the session virtually. Professor Chung, it's good to see you again.
Good to see you.
I also have Dr. Patrick Cronin at Hudson Institute live on the line. Dr. Cronin, it's a pleasure.
Thank you.
Right. Professor Chung, according to the top office here, the president will share South Korea's role as a global leader committed to international concerns during his keynote speech. That being said, what are some global issues that you believe South Korea can actively work to commit to?
Well, I think it will reflect the current international landscape like coronavirus, pandemic, energy security, and climate change. Of course, Ukraine crisis. All of these issues do not exist separately at the same time. It is entangled with great power politics. So South Korea is not immune from those threats. So that's why United Nations mentions that this year is a kind of watershed and international order is at the crossroads. So in that sense, so President Yoon probably emphasized the value of solidarity between democracies and they underline how South Korea can contribute just in the rules-based order and universal value, especially in terms of development assistance to support victims from pandemic, food security, and recovery of Ukraine. Of course, helping building and supply chains and infrastructure across the Indo-Pacific might be appear in its agenda during the UN Assembly.
Right, indeed. And Dr. Cronin, how do you respond to the Yoon administration's hopes to perhaps expand South Korea's participation in global affairs? I mean, what are your prospects with regard to these intentions?
Well, I think the prospects are excellent because the demand is there. The world needs more peace. It needs more responses to global challenges like climate change and COVID. It needs the protection against nuclear proliferation and war. The political will is there from South Korea, from President Yoon. He's showing that South Korea is one of the top countries in the world. There are 193 members of the United Nations, and South Korea is in the top 5%. So if it's not South Korea leading to help promote answers and solutions and to mobilize the world community together to find common solutions and strengthen multilateralism, who is it going to be? So it's very important for South Korea to do this. Implementation will be key, and the trick, I think, for the Yoon administration will be to find issues that resonate with the South Korean electorate and population that are also very much in need of responses globally.
Right. And keeping Dr. Cronin's kind words in mind, Professor Chung, speaking within your capacity, of course, as a scholar, do you believe that South Korea can now perhaps afford to look beyond its national borders and interests to promote those of the international community?
Well, President Yoon made it clear from his inauguration that South Korea is willing to serve as a global pivotal state with a strategic clarity. That's a kind of big difference from the previous administrations. And I think it reflects the Yoon administration's understanding that South Korea developed into a democratic country with successful economic development under this rules-based liberal order. So in that sense, Yoon administration will take a more assertive role, but its diplomatic resource and priority might be diverted to the current issues in Korean Peninsula, especially North Korea issue. As you all know, that North Korea has conducted missile tests multiple times from the beginning of this year and changed the nature of negotiation with the United States from denuclearization to arms control. So that become a major challenger that makes South Korea more formidable to achieve its global agenda and global role.
Right. And Dr. Cronin, President Yoon is also expected to reiterate calls for North Korea to abandon its nuclear ambitions at the UN platform. That being said, what first are your thoughts with regard to President Yoon's audacious plan for North Korea?
Well, it's important to stand up for nuclear nonproliferation and to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula. So he's doing the right thing, even though it has very slim chance of succeeding, given the fact that Kim Jong-un is just enshrined in law, not just permanent nuclear weapon status for North Korea, but the actual preemptive use of nuclear weapons if North Korean regime feels threatened. That's a threat to Northeast Asia, to international security. So audacious plan may not work, but it is very important for the Yoon administration to stand up for the right thing for this rules-based system for nuclear non-proliferation.
Right, and Professor Chung, as Dr. Cronin has mentioned earlier this month, North Korea virtually, well, it's set in stone, perhaps, its nuclear status by putting in force a law that allows for preemptive nuclear strikes. And Kim Jong-un himself vowed that he would never give up his nuclear weapons. What, perhaps, are the broader implications of this latest display of defiance, if I may?
Well, I think the recent codifications of nuclear first use doctrine is not that surprising. And given that North Korea is not a country of rule of law, it is not necessary as well. But what North Korea is saying is that it is a nuclear state and it should be recognized as a nuclear state and will not rest from the negotiation for denuclearization in the near term. And during the Spring People's Assembly meeting last year, Kim Jong-un made it clear that it is not an object of negotiation as well, especially the economic compensation as addressed by audacious initiative under the Yoon administration. So I think South Korea's audacious initiative, as Patrick mentions, is in kind of confronting major challenges from the North Korea and necessitate to rebalance the components of its audacious initiative. So in that sense, it is meaningful that we are kind of working on extended deterrence measure with the United States and tightly coordinate trilateral coordination with Japan as well. So the South Korea is expecting the summit between Japan and with Japan in the New York. So I think we're gonna kind of send a clear signal to North Korea that South Korea is not challenged by its recent codification.
Right. And Dr. Cronin, do you suppose this latest announcement by Kim Jong-un is perhaps an attempt to redirect attention back to North Korea and perhaps leverage his negotiating power?
Well, Kim Jong-un has a knack for gaining attention, and certainly he wants all the leverage he can get, but I think it's more than that. I think Kim Jong-un has his own audacious plan, and it's a strategy to solidify his legitimacy and his strength and power at home, but also his influence abroad. And right now, I think he feels emboldened by essentially the full backing of Beijing and Moscow, and he's flaunting this in international rhetoric to basically say to Seoul and Tokyo and Washington and others, what are you going to do about it? Because I am going to move ahead with my nuclear status, and you're going to have to deal with me on that basis in the future. So I'm going to dictate the terms of diplomacy. You're not going to determine them.
Right. Professor Chung, I ask this as a layman, of course, as a layperson. If nuclear disarmament is not likely, would it not be more practical, perhaps, to focus on nuclear arms control and perhaps make sure or discourage North Korea from making new nuclear weapons and perhaps allowing it to keep the ones it already owns?
Well, as a temporary measure, of course, arms control or reduction of nuclear arsenal might be understandable, but that does not make South Korea safer. And also strategic stability in the Northeast Asia will be in peril and violating the non-proliferation norms. And as Patrick mentions, and now behind North Korea, there is China and Russia, even though it is a tactical alignment, which will embolden North Korea's kind of assertiveness in the regions. And of course, it is not about South Korea, but also regional countries and regional partners such as Japan will make it more seriously about this issue as well. So as a temporary measure, of course, it can be accepted, but in the long term, denuclearization is necessary.
Dr. Cronin, simply speaking then, what would be the broader implications of acknowledging North Korea as a nuclear power state, which of course the US has ruled out?
Well, there are two basic problems with that. The first is that Kim Jong-un might misperceive it as weakness. And if he sees weakness, who knows what he'll ask for next or what he'll do next. The second problem is that it could puncture the solidarity of the U.S.-South Korean alliance. It is the Yoon administration that from day one requested from Washington a resumption of extended deterrence talks. Those talks are just now underway. So it's very important for the United States to fully support and embrace our South Korean ally as it tries to deal with this issue over the long term. So there are problems with this. If North Korea really wants negotiations, it can sit down at the table anytime with South Korea and the United States. It simply has to acknowledge that it's not going to permanently hold on to nuclear weapons because that contravenes not only past commitments and international legal requirements, but also peace and security in the region.
Professor Chung, President Yoon Suk-yeol has been in office for a little over 4 months now, and on the international stage has been actively seeking for support for regional peace and stability amid Pyongyang's provocations, of course. How do you assess his efforts, perhaps, and their significance?
Well, I think current Yoon administration has confronted one of the formidable international landscape if compared to his predecessors. War in Ukraine, Chinese assertiveness is getting stronger, and North Korea's nuclear ambitions. And all three of these countries are aligned together, which make a kind of blockization in the region as well. So this international landscape make it very difficult for South Korea to pursue its global agenda, not to mention of North Korea's denuclearizations. But the dilemma is that South Korea cannot be just remained within the Korean peninsula. South Korea itself is at the crossroad to become a global pivotal power or kind of more meaningful middle power in the region. So in that sense, Yoon administration is kind of rebalancing and try to figure out how these challenges can be navigated with cooperation with allies and partners. So in that sense, we can understand South Korea's endeavor to be more multilateralized and to be partners of regional countries and solid kind of consolidated cooperation with the United States.
Right. And in the meantime, Dr. Cronin, North Korea, it's been an active advocate of Russia and its invasion of Ukraine. Pundits say this stance perhaps reflects its hopes for continued Russian veto power at the UN Security Council against additional sanctions in the event of another nuclear test. What are your thoughts on this view?
Well, when you're a country facing so many sanctions from the UN Security Council, you certainly want as many votes there as you can get. And so certainly supporting Russia's war in Ukraine is one way to win Moscow's favor. But as Professor Chung's talking about, I think correctly, North Korea sort of recalibrating its sort of regional relations, or rather South Korea recalibrating its relations globally. I think North Korea has its own plan again here to use this revisionist alignment with China, with Russia, and perhaps with Iran and others to push back on the United States and South Korea and Japan and others. And it sees an opportunity here. So it's not just about the votes. It's about thinking there's momentum, or at least wanting to show that there's momentum behind this. And so just as President Yoon could go to Madrid and the NATO summit and embrace the NATO strategic concept, Kim Jong-un now can maybe talk about sending arms to the war in Ukraine. It's very bad timing, of course, because Russia's just had serious setbacks in the war in Ukraine, rather embarrassing for a so-called major power against Ukraine.
Right. And against that backdrop, Professor Chung, China's Xi Jinping, quite contrary to expectations, if I may, has expressed questions and concerns with regard to the situation in Ukraine during bilateral talks with his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin, as my colleague Kim Hyo-sun mentioned earlier. How do you interpret Beijing's or President Xi Jinping's latest stance with regard to the situation in Ukraine?
Well, China, of course, tactically aligned with Russia as well in terms of Ukraine crisis. It does not really support, but at the same time, China mentions that it supported rules-based orders and does not really support it or send the kind of material support to the Russian so far. So in that sense, China is kind of hedging or balancing the situations and try kind of minimize the kind of risk out of this Ukraine crisis. So that is the kind of stance that it's not kind of fully confront the United States, but at the same time, it is kind of balancing the kind of relationship between Russia and the United States.
Right, and staying with Russia and China, Dr. Cronin, in response to Xi Jinping's stance with regard to Ukraine, Vladimir Putin said that he, actually thanked the Chinese leader for his balanced view with regard to the war in Ukraine. Do you see this attitude perhaps as affecting or influencing his future direction, perhaps, with regard to the war in Ukraine? Or is that wishful thinking on my part?
Well, there's bound to be some influence, but I think it's mostly wishful thinking because Putin is all in on aggression. He can't really take it back. The most he can do is stop going forward, and the Ukrainian military is already helping him do that. So he's in a very embarrassing situation. He's lost face. Remember, February 24th, he was able to go into Ukraine knowing that he had this no limits backing by China. Now, it turns out there are limits to China. They don't want to lose. And Russia's right now losing.
Right. All right, Dr. Cronin, as always, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts. And Professor Chung, thank you very much for your insights today.
Thank you.
Thank you.